The thing about The Walking Dead, and I've been sitting with this thought for a little while now, is that it's one of those rare cultural things that has an almost absurd amount of stuff around it. Not just the episodes themselves, which run to 11 seasons plus a whole constellation of spin-offs, but all the production history, the casting decisions that nearly went differently, the behind-the-scenes choices that shaped the finished thing in ways most people never think about, the gap between what something became and what it very nearly was. That's the part I find most interesting, I think. So tonight, or this morning, or whatever quiet hour it happens to be, wherever you are, we're going to go through 150 of my favourite facts about The Walking Dead. The show, the comic it came from, the actors, the crew, the strange little corners of production history and trivia that I've collected over the years. Some of these you'll already know, some of them you probably won't. And if you find that a few feel familiar, that's completely fine. Part of the appeal of a video like this is just sitting with something you already love, hearing about it at a comfortable pace. No rush, no urgency. There are 16 sections tonight, each one covering a different corner of the Walking Dead world. We'll start with where it all began, the comic book that Robert Kirkman wrote in 2003 that somehow became one of the biggest television franchises of the century so far. Then we'll move through the making of the show, the casting stories, the walkers and the people who designed them, the towns in Georgia where it was all filmed, the deaths and departures, and all the things that almost happened differently. We'll end with the show's finale and what came after. If you fall asleep somewhere around section 7, that is an absolute win. That's the whole point, really. I should say that these facts are drawn from a fairly wide range of sources: production interviews, cast commentary, behind-the-scenes documentation, and the considerable amount of material that accumulated around the franchise across 15+ years of it being in the public eye. Some of them are well known in Walking Dead circles, others are more obscure. I've tried to mix the two in a way that feels balanced. A few things you'll nod at because you already know them, and a few things that might be genuinely new. That's the ratio I like in these videos. One more thing before we start. This is not that kind of video where I'm trying to make you feel like you're missing something if you don't stay awake to the end. There's no revelation waiting in section 16. Each section is its own self-contained thing, and you can drift away from it at any point without losing anything. The whole is just a lot of the parts. So settle in, close your eyes if you like, and let's spend some time in a world that, for all its darkness, managed to mean quite a lot to quite a lot of people. Before we get into it, if you're new here and you're enjoying the sound of this, it would mean quite a lot if you subscribed. It's free, it takes about 3 seconds, and it genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. Right, that's more than enough of that. Let's go. The comics world that Kirkman was working in at the time was one where ongoing creator-owned series at Image, the publisher he eventually landed with, had a mixed track record. Image had been founded in the early 90s by artists who left Marvel precisely to own their work, and its output over the decade before The Walking Dead was a combination of genuinely interesting creator-owned material and a great deal of work that didn't find a lasting audience. Kirkman was a relative newcomer, known at that point primarily for a superhero series called Invincible, also published by Image, which had started in 2003 and has since become quite significant in its own right. The Walking Dead was a companion project in the sense that it was launched around the same time, from the same publisher, by the same writer, but the tone was entirely different. Invincible is a superhero book, relatively bright in register, despite its frequent violence. The Walking Dead was something else from the first page. What's interesting about that early period is that neither book looked, from the outside, like it would become a franchise. They were small circulation independent comics. Kirkman was writing both simultaneously, which is a considerable amount of work, even before the level of detail and consistency that both series demanded. The Walking Dead was always the more restrained of the two in terms of action set pieces. It was driven more by the psychological and the social, by what happens to people under sustained stress, which is a harder thing to make compelling in a visual medium than action is. And the fact that it succeeded at it from early on tells you something about Kirkman's instincts as a writer. Tony Moore's artwork in those first 6 issues has a quality that the later Charlie Adlard issues don't quite replicate. Moore's figures are slightly more expressive, slightly looser. There's a kinetic quality to the action sequences that has a different energy from Adlard's more controlled, deliberate style. Neither is better than the other. They're different, and the transition happens at a point in the story where a tonal shift actually makes a certain sense anyway. But Moore's issues have a particular feeling that dedicated readers often describe with fondness, a roughness that feels appropriate to where the story was in those opening chapters. So the whole thing starts in 2003, which still feels slightly remarkable when you think about how big the franchise eventually became. Robert Kirkman, who was at that point a relatively unknown writer working in the independent comics world, pitched a series to Image Comics, with a premise that was, on the surface, fairly simple. A zombie story, a survival story, characters navigating an apocalyptic world. Nothing about that logline sounds unusual, especially not now, but Kirkman's original pitch had one genuinely unusual element. He promised that it would never end. Not in the sense that it would run forever necessarily, but that it wouldn't follow the traditional arc of a movie or a short story. No resolution waiting at the end of the tunnel, just life continuing in the way life tends to do even when everything is terrible. That was the pitch, an ongoing human drama that happened to have zombies in it, told with the patience of a long novel rather than the urgency of a horror film. I think that distinction matters more than it might seem, actually. The reason The Walking Dead worked as well as it did, especially in the early years, was precisely because it had that novelistic patience. It was interested in what people did when things got bad, not just in whether they survived. Now here's a detail about the pitch that I find genuinely funny. When Kirkman presented the comic to Image Comics, he apparently told them it was based on a Japanese manga property. There was no manga. He made it up on the spot because he thought Image would be more interested if there was already a foreign source material with a proven audience. They were, in fact, more interested. The manga did not exist. Kirkman later admitted this freely. It was a fairly brazen piece of invented credentials, and it worked. The first issue was published in October 2003. It sold somewhere around 7,000 copies, which is a quiet debut by any standard. In the independent comics world, it wasn't considered a failure, but nobody at the time looked at those numbers and thought they were watching the beginning of something that would eventually become a billion-dollar television franchise. That's not how these things tend to announce themselves. The original artist on the book was Tony Moore, who drew the first 6 issues and whose style has a slightly rougher, more kinetic quality than what followed. Then from issue 7 onward, Charlie Adlard took over the art, and Adlard stayed for the rest of the comics run, which is quite something given how long it went on. Kirkman and Moore had a financial dispute somewhere along the way, which was eventually settled out of court. The details were kept private, as these things tend to be, but Moore has spoken about it publicly over the years. One detail that tends to surprise people who come to the comic after the show is how much more violent and explicit the comic is in certain respects. The show, for all its darkness, operates within broadcast standards and the practical realities of what you can depict on screen. The comic had no such constraints. Some sequences in the comic that the show adapted were necessarily softened, not necessarily in terms of their emotional impact, but in terms of their visual directness. The Negan introduction is one of the few cases where the show arguably matched the comic's directness. Most other times, the comic went places the show couldn't quite follow. One of the things that's worth knowing about the comic is that Rick Grimes loses his hand. Fairly early on, as these things go, it happens during the Governor storyline. Kirkman always intended it. The show, as you may know, kept both of Rick's hands intact for the entire time Andrew Lincoln was in it, and the reason for that is almost entirely practical. They calculated that the cost of filming a lead actor with a prosthetic hand for years of television production would be too high and too logistically complicated, so Rick's hand stayed on. The comic version of Rick carries that amputation for the rest of his story. Daryl Dixon, who eventually became arguably the show's most beloved character, does not exist anywhere in the comic at all. Never appears. He was created entirely for television, which we'll talk about at length later because the circumstances around his creation are rather good. Carol is another interesting case of comic versus show divergence. In the comic, Carol's arc ends quite differently than what television viewers saw. Without going too deep into it here, we'll come back to the comic versus show comparisons in a later section. The short version is that comic Carol becomes deeply unstable after a relationship breakdown, and her story ends early and quite tragically. The television version of Carol, over 8 or 9 seasons, went somewhere almost completely different. Melissa McBride's Carol ended up being one of the finest character arcs in the entire show. It's a remarkable contrast, actually. Kirkman ran the comic for 193 issues, and then he ended it, which is how the story goes, without any advance announcement. The final issue, number 193, was published in July 2019, and readers found out it was the last one when they read it. There was a letter from Kirkman at the back explaining that he'd decided the story was complete, that he knew roughly when he wanted to end it, and that he wanted readers to experience the ending the way characters in the story experience death without warning, which is either a wonderful gesture or slightly annoying depending on your perspective and your feelings about advance notice. I think it's rather wonderful personally. It's very consistent with the whole philosophy of the thing. The final image of the comic, and I'll try to be vague enough here not to spoil it for anyone who wants to read it, shows Carl as an adult, decades after the events of the main story, in a world that has slowly, imperfectly rebuilt itself. It's a quiet and genuinely moving ending. The television show never directly replicated it, and in some ways couldn't, given the different fates the characters ended up with. But the spirit of it is there in the franchise somewhere, I think, if you look for it. One detail about the pilot's reception that I find interesting is the way AMC marketed it. They leaned significantly into the Halloween premiere date, October 31st as mentioned, which was either a brilliant piece of scheduling or a happy coincidence depending on who you ask. The promotional campaign emphasized the horror elements, the spectacle of the walker-filled city, the visual scale of what they'd built, but the show itself, as anyone who's watched the pilot knows, is actually quite restrained in that regard. The horror is there, but it's not the dominant register. Darabont's instinct was always character first, which meant the marketing slightly misrepresented the product in a way that could have been a problem, and in this case, wasn't. The 6-episode first season was a practical and financial hedge, but it also had a creative advantage. It forced the storytelling to be efficient. There's no space in 6 episodes for the kind of extended padding that later seasons of the show would sometimes fall into. Every episode had to earn its existence, and the result is a first season that holds together exceptionally well. If you go back and watch it now, knowing everything that followed, the tightness of it is almost surprising. The show's episode order was expanded for subsequent seasons. Season 2 got 13 episodes, which nearly doubled the season's length and created different structural challenges. Some critics argued that the longer season format worked against the show's interests, giving the story room to breathe that occasionally turned into room to drift. The debate about whether Walking Dead benefited from more episodes or fewer is one that ran through most of the show's critical discussion. The journey from a modestly selling independent comic to a prestige cable television series is not always a straightforward one, and in the case of The Walking Dead, it took several years and required a couple of things happening in the right order. The first was Frank Darabont. Darabont, who directed The Shawshank Redemption and The Green Mile, both of which are adaptations of Stephen King's work, which tells you something about his aesthetic sensibility, optioned the rights to the comic in 2005. The reported price for that option was $10,000, which in retrospect is extraordinary, not in a scandalous way exactly. That's how options work, and Kirkman retained the right to benefit significantly from whatever came after. But $10,000 for what would become the foundation of a billion-dollar franchise is one of those numbers that doesn't quite compute when you say it out loud. Darabont spent several years developing the project and finding it impossible to get any network genuinely interested. The mid-2000s were a particular moment for prestige drama. The Sopranos was ending, The Wire was running, Mad Men was just getting started, but zombie content was still considered fairly niche. The common wisdom, such as it was, held that you could do a zombie film, but a zombie television series was a harder sell. It was too long, too bleak, too committed to a premise that could wear out its welcome. MC changed their mind on a lot of things around this period. They'd had significant success with Mad Men starting in 2007 and were developing Breaking Bad, and the network had repositioned itself as a home for serious, ambitious drama. When Darabont brought them The Walking Dead, the timing was better than it might have been 5 years earlier. They greenlit a pilot. The first season order was for 6 episodes, which is extremely short by American cable standards. It reflects, I think, genuine uncertainty about whether the thing would work, a test run more than a full commitment. The pilot budget was reportedly around $11 million for a single episode, which is a significant bet on an unproven property. That number was driven partly by Darabont's name and partly by the scale of what the pilot needed to achieve. A post-apocalyptic world, thousands of walkers, and a tone that had to establish itself quickly and clearly. Darabont wrote and directed the pilot himself. Days Gone By, the first episode, is one of the finest pilots in cable drama, and that's not a particularly controversial opinion. It's measured and patient and visually confident, and it opens in a way that AMC's executives were apparently quite nervous about. A little girl walking away from the camera, who turns around and is a walker, and who Rick shoots in the head in the first 3 minutes. No setup, no explanation, just that. Darabont held firm on keeping the opening as it was, which was the right call. Before Andrew Lincoln was cast as Rick Grimes, the role was reportedly considered for other actors. Johnny Lee Miller's name has come up in various accounts of the casting process. What's interesting about Lincoln ultimately getting the role is that he's English, born in London, raised in the south of England, and spent the entire run of the show maintaining a Southern American accent. We'll talk more about that when we get to the casting section, because it's a rather remarkable sustained performance in that specific sense. The show premiered on Halloween night, October 31st, 2010, and it drew 5.35 million viewers, which was the highest rated drama premiere in basic cable history at that point. Not just for AMC, for all of basic cable, on Halloween, which is either a brilliant scheduling decision or a happy accident or both, and it set up the show's run in a way that nobody, including the people who made it, had quite anticipated. One detail worth knowing about the development process is that the show's original intention was to follow the comic more closely, including Rick eventually losing his hand at the appropriate narrative moment. That plan was changed not for creative reasons, but for budget reasons. The cost of a lead actor working with a prosthetic for a full long-running television series was simply too high. So Rick kept both hands, and the show diverged from the comic in that foundational physical way from relatively early on. Darabont's departure after season 1, he was fired by AMC in a dispute that later became a lengthy lawsuit, changed the creative trajectory of the show in ways that are difficult to fully measure. But we'll come back to that later in the section on what almost was. The scene where Rick wakes up in the hospital and tries to navigate the building is often cited as one of the pilot's best sequences, and it's worth thinking about why it works as well as it does. It's almost entirely wordless for a substantial stretch. Rick moves through a space that was once ordered and functional, and is now chaotic and dark, and the camera follows him in a way that doesn't explain anything. The audience is discovering the world at the same pace Rick is. That quality, discovery rather than explanation, was something Darabont was very deliberate about, and it gives the pilot a trust in the audience's ability to follow without being guided that a lot of television doesn't have. The scene where Rick finds the bicycle and then encounters the legless walker crawling in the park is perhaps the pilot's most human moment. He goes back for her, the legless walker he encountered earlier, and shoots her and apologizes to her before he does it. It's a small scene, and it establishes something essential about Rick's character. He can't leave things broken, even when there's no practical reason to fix them. That instinct is both his most valuable quality and eventually his greatest source of vulnerability across the whole story. The quarry camp has a specific visual texture that sets it up as a provisional, impermanent space. Everything about it reads as temporary. The tents, the makeshift organisation, the way people are arranged around a central fire. The production designed it to look like a collection of individuals who have ended up together rather than a community that chose to form. That distinction, ended up together versus chose to form, becomes increasingly significant as the seasons go on, and the question of what a community means in this world moves to the centre of the story. There's something I find quietly satisfying about the specific logistical details of how a film or television pilot gets made, the particular choices that had to be made on particular days in particular locations, the happy accidents, and the practical solutions. The Walking Dead pilot has several of those. The opening sequence with Rick driving alone on an empty Georgia highway was filmed on an actual stretch of road near Senoia, Georgia, in the early hours of the morning. They shut down a real section of highway to get those wide shots, the long view of the abandoned cars, the quiet, the absolute absence of other human beings. Senoia is a small town about 30 miles south of Atlanta that would go on to become almost synonymous with Walking Dead production. But at that point, it was simply the most convenient rural Georgia location for what the pilot needed. The tank in downtown Atlanta, the one Rick hides in, while surrounded by walkers in the first episode's climactic sequence, is a real tank. A genuine M60 pattern, which the production team located and acquired. The exterior scenes were filmed with the actual tank, and the interior scenes were filmed inside a separate replica set built specifically for that purpose. There's something rather pleasingly practical about that. They found a real tank and used it, which is a level of commitment to authenticity that not all productions would bother with. The horse that Rick rides into Atlanta was named Blade on set. Blade's eventual fate in the episode, surrounded and devoured by walkers, while Rick escapes underneath the tank, was upsetting to a number of crew members who had grown genuinely fond of him during production. This is not an uncommon thing on set. Animals involved in film and television productions tend to attract attachment quickly. Blade was fine, for the record. What happens to the horse on screen is not what happened to the horse. The helicopter Rick glimpses in the first episode, a brief reflection in a skyscraper window as he rides into the city, is one of those details that took years to fully pay off. That helicopter, or one like it, belongs to the Civic Republic military, which eventually becomes the central mystery and antagonist force of the later franchise. It's referenced as far back as Episode 1. Whether that was always planned or was a piece of retroactive continuity, I'm honestly not entirely sure. But the effect of it is that the world had a coherent, larger shape from the very beginning, which I think is rather elegant. Rick's sheriff's uniform in the pilot was sourced from actual King County, Georgia Sheriff's Department, surplus. The costume department wanted it to look genuinely worn and lived in rather than like a costume, and getting the real thing served that purpose better than anything they could have had made. Multiple duplicates were acquired for the production run. The hospital scenes, where Rick wakes up alone in an empty ward and tries to navigate a building that's fallen apart, were filmed at a real decommissioned hospital in Georgia. I find this detail slightly eerie in the best possible way. The production didn't need to dress it heavily because it was already in a state of genuine disrepair. The flickering lights, the disorder, the sense of abandonment, much of that was simply what the building already was. They added the "don't open dead inside" door with the reaching hands, which was apparently a last-minute addition on the day of shooting when a prop department idea came together quickly, and it became one of the most iconic images the show ever produced. Glenn's introduction, the voice on the tank radio saying, "Hey, you, dumbass, you in the tank, cozy in there?" was written as a deliberate beat of levity after the sustained tension of the pilot's first act. Something human and slightly funny to break the atmosphere. It's one of the most quoted lines in the show's history, and it comes from that specific functional need. The story needed to breathe for a moment. Stephen Yeun delivers it with exactly the right amount of casual irritation, which is a harder thing to calibrate than it sounds. Morgan and Dwayne's scenes in the pilot were slightly longer in an earlier cut, with a bit more backstory woven through. Some of that was trimmed for pacing. Lenny James, who plays Morgan, is one of those actors who does an enormous amount with very little. His restraint in those early scenes, the weight he gives to lines that are just practical dialogue about walker behaviour and survival logistics, is what makes the character instantly interesting. Morgan would go on to become a significant figure across multiple seasons and eventually crossover into Fear the Walking Dead, which is a trajectory nobody was expecting from his introduction in episode 1. The quarry camp that appears in episode 2 was filmed in a real quarry in Fulton County, Georgia. The production had to negotiate, access, and deal with actual wildlife during the shoot, which is a very specific kind of production problem. There's something appropriate about that. An apocalypse story being made in places that have their own unpredictable natural lives going on, regardless of what the cameras need. Many of the casting choices reflected a clear preference for performers with theatre backgrounds, or training rather than primarily screen-based careers. Lincoln had done significant stage work in England. Guerrera is a playwright as well as an actor. Her own dramatic writing has been critically acclaimed and produced internationally. McBride comes from a background that includes both film and theatre work. The effect of this on the ensemble's quality is difficult to isolate precisely, but I think it contributes to the show's ability to sustain extended dialogue scenes and quiet character moments without losing attention. Theatre training teaches you to fill a space with specificity, to communicate when nothing is happening as well as when something is. That's a useful skill in a show that periodically asks its cast to do a lot with very little. The show's relationship with its cast was notable for its loyalty in both directions. Several actors who joined for limited arcs, a few episodes, a season, stayed through extended runs because the material kept developing their characters in directions that warranted staying. The opposite also happened. Actors who might have been expected to stay longer departed, some by creative choice and some by the show's choice. The general atmosphere of uncertainty about character survival, which was again partly intentional, extended into the professional reality of being in the cast. Nobody could be entirely sure they'd be back for the next season. There's a specific quality that Andrew Lincoln brings to Rick Grimes that I think is underappreciated because it's quiet. He's very good at showing thinking, at showing a character processing information and arriving at decisions in real time without the process being announced through obvious facial expression or body language. The scenes where Rick is faced with a choice and the character is faced with choices constantly, that's essentially the entire dramatic engine of his arc, have a texture that comes from Lincoln not telegraphing the outcome. You watch the decision being made. That's a rarer skill than it might seem. Something that gets less attention than it probably should is the ensemble work in the middle seasons, the period roughly from season 3 through season 5, when the show had assembled a cast of considerable depth and was giving most of them something genuine to do. The dynamics between characters who weren't necessarily given spotlight episodes, the background relationships, the implied histories, the way characters behaved differently around different people, gave the world a populated feeling that's actually quite difficult to achieve. It requires actors who stay in their characters, even in scenes they're not leading, which is a discipline thing as much as a talent thing. Sonequa Martin-Green, who plays Sasha, is one of the more underrated performances in the show's later period. Sasha's arc, the grief over her brother's death, the gradual movement towards suicidal risk-taking, the specific dignity of her eventual end, is handled with a precision that didn't always get the attention it deserved, partly because it happened in seasons when the critical consensus on the show had already shifted towards skepticism. The work was good regardless of what the surrounding conversation was saying. Andrew Lincoln is from London. This is something that a fairly large number of Walking Dead viewers discovered only partway through the show's run, and the reaction tends to be a mix of surprise and then retrospective appreciation for how well maintained the accent was across a decade of production. He spent months working with a dialect coach before filming the pilot and wore an earpiece in the early seasons to help keep the Southern American inflection consistent. Listening to him in interviews as himself, speaking in his regular voice, and then immediately putting on a scene from the show is a slightly vertiginous experience. They're genuinely different people, vocally. Lauren Cohan, who plays Maggie, is in a similar position. She was born in Pennsylvania, but grew up primarily in England, and plays a Georgia farmer's daughter throughout the run of the show. She and Lincoln apparently found the shared experience of maintaining American accents on a Southern American set a source of quiet amusement between them. Norman Reedus, who went on to become Daryl Dixon, did not originally audition for that role. He auditioned for Merle Dixon, Daryl's brother, a rather unpleasant and volatile character who appears in early seasons before his own complicated arc. He didn't get that role, but something about the audition impressed the creative team enough that rather than simply moving on, they created a new character specifically for him. Daryl Dixon was written as a vehicle for Reedus because the casting process had identified something they wanted to use that the existing parts didn't fit. That's not how television casting usually works, and it produced arguably the show's most beloved character, which tells you something about the value of paying attention to what an actor brings, rather than just whether they fit what's already written. Stephen Yeun, Glenn Rhee, was doing improv comedy in Chicago when he was cast. He was relatively unknown at the point of casting, which made Glenn's eventual fate all the more affecting for audiences who had, in a sense, watched Yeun himself become well known in parallel with Glenn's story over 6 seasons. He's spoken about the audition process feeling surreal given the scale of what the production eventually became. At the time, it was just another cable pilot, one of dozens being made that year. Melissa McBride, who plays Carol, had a prior connection to Frank Darabont through a smaller role in an earlier project of his. He thought of her specifically when the role of Carol was being cast, a quiet, somewhat overlooked woman in a difficult domestic situation. What he and the other writers almost certainly didn't fully anticipate was that McBride would eventually turn Carol into one of the most complex and compelling characters in the show, through a combination of her performance and the writer's growing understanding of what she was capable of. But that's a longer story for a later section. Danai Gurira was cast as Michonne before the character had properly appeared on screen. Her actual introduction, the hooded, masked figure leading 2 armless walkers on chains, coming to Andrea's rescue at the end of Season 2, was a brief glimpse. The internet's response to that brief glimpse was considerable. There's something effective about introducing a character by withholding their face, giving you only posture and movement and the strangeness of those 2 walkers on chains, and letting the audience's imagination fill in the rest. By the time Michonne's face appeared clearly in Season 3, the audience was already invested. David Morrissey, who played the Governor, the primary antagonist of seasons 3 and 4, was cast largely because of his work in British productions where he demonstrated an ability to play quiet menace. The creative team wanted someone who could seem plausible and reasonable and even charming, and then turn into something frightening without a clear seam between the two states. That's a specific quality, and it's genuinely difficult to find. Morrissey has it. Chandler Riggs was 10 years old when he was cast as Carl. He did his schoolwork between takes for his entire time on the show and spent essentially his whole adolescence in that production. There's something interesting about watching Carl age across 8 seasons in real time. The character's development is inseparable from Riggs's own physical and emotional development, which gives those later seasons a quality that's difficult to manufacture artificially. Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who plays Negan, has said that before he took the role, he was warned that the character was sufficiently hated from the comics, particularly for the act Negan commits in his introduction, that he should expect to be recognised and verbally confronted in public. This did, apparently, happen. Someone shouting at Jeffrey Dean Morgan in a supermarket for what Negan did to Glenn is a strange collision of fiction and reality that seems to follow the show's biggest villains around. Pollyanna McIntosh, who played Jadis/Anne, the leader of the Scavengers, the group with the unusual clipped speech pattern, spent significant time developing that linguistic register with the creative team before her first episode. It's a fairly extreme creative choice, having an entire community speak in a deliberately stripped down way, and it's the kind of thing that could easily become a distraction. Whether it always worked is a matter of some debate among fans. I have a soft spot for it personally, but I understand why it bothered people. The show had an interesting relationship with casting relative unknowns alongside more established names. The core cast, Lincoln, Reedus, McBride, Yoon, were not household names when the show started. That's part of what made the early seasons feel groundedly real. Nobody came in with baggage. You met these people as these characters, and there was nothing else to contend with. The development of Daryl's backstory, the hints rather than explicit explanations of what his life was like before the apocalypse, is one of the more quietly effective pieces of character writing in the show's history. The glimpses you get of his relationship with Merle, the particular survival skills he has that suggest a specific kind of rural upbringing, the way he relates to people who've been marginalised or overlooked. None of this is spelled out in a single scene where Daryl explains himself. It accumulates across many seasons through small moments, which is the right way to do it, I think. Characters who explain themselves fully in one conversation tend to feel explained rather than known. The relationship between Daryl and Beth, which occupies a significant part of Season 4's second half, is interesting, partly because it pushed Daryl into a dynamic, a mentorship, a tentative emotional opening that he hadn't been in before with another character. The episodes they share in that section of the season are slower and more intimate than most Walking Dead episodes, and they work largely because Reedus and Emily Kinney find a register together that feels genuinely different from the rest of the show. Whatever you thought of the story, and opinions varied, the performance quality in those episodes is rather high. Daryl's relationship with Carol across the whole run of the show is probably the franchise's most enduring emotional through line. It starts as mutual wariness, becomes protectiveness, becomes something that the show is careful never to define too precisely. A love of some kind, not quite romantic, but not merely friendship, something that has its own specific quality. The audience's investment in that relationship was substantial enough that the Daryl Dixon spin-off, at least in its announced form, was planned to eventually reunite them in some capacity. It's worth spending a bit of time specifically on Daryl Dixon because the circumstances of his creation are a slightly unusual production story that I think illuminates something about how the show found itself. Daryl and Merle Dixon were both invented entirely for the television adaptation. Neither character appears anywhere in the comic. Merle was written first to the abrasive, difficult older brother, And then when Reedus came in and didn't quite fit that role, but clearly had something worth using, Daryl was built around him. He was originally written as fairly generic in temperament, a rough survivalist type, younger than Merle, carrying some of the same volatile energy, but quieter about it. The character you see in early season 1 is interesting, but not obviously the person who is going to anchor the show's emotional life for the next decade. What changed it was a combination of Reedus's performance and the writer's room responding to that performance in real time. The way Reedus plays Daryl's physicality, the particular slouch, the way he holds the crossbow low and slightly diagonal, the way he takes up slightly less space than his frame should, was something Reedus developed himself, and it communicates a character history without any dialogue needing to explain it. He moves like someone who learned to be small. That's a rather good piece of character work. The crossbow was Reedus's own suggestion. He wanted Daryl to have a weapon that felt personal and skill-based rather than simply utilitarian, something that required patience and practice and said something about the person who chose it. The creative team agreed immediately. The crossbow became as much Daryl's visual signature as Rick's hat or Michonne's katana, and it was arrived at through that simple conversation. Daryl's vest with the angel wings on the back was a costume department creation, and there's a pleasant irony built into it that I think the show was aware of. The most dangerous character, the one most likely to be the last person standing in any given fight, wears angel wings. Reedus loved it from the moment he saw it. It stayed. The question of Daryl's sexuality was something the show orbited without ever directly addressing. Robert Kirkman has said in interviews that he considers Daryl to be asexual, that's simply how the character exists in his understanding. The show never stated this explicitly, but it also never pushed Daryl toward a romantic relationship in the way it did almost every other significant character. There's something in that restraint that I find interesting, actually. It felt like a choice rather than an oversight. Daryl was written toward death several times, not as a creative decision that made it to screen, but as a possibility that was seriously discussed in the writer's room at multiple points across the seasons. The reason it kept not happening was, in part, the audience's response to even the suggestion. The fan reaction to storylines that put Daryl in serious danger was so intense, the phrase, "If Daryl dies, we riot," circulated widely enough that it became a genuine cultural reference point, that it became a factor in the creative calculus, which raises interesting questions about the relationship between audience investment and narrative freedom, though I'll leave that particular thread there for now. What I find most interesting about Daryl as a character is the way his emotional journey is primarily expressed through action and physicality rather than dialogue. He's not given the long expository speeches or the direct emotional confrontations that other characters get. His grief, his attachment, his protective instincts, they come through in what he does and how he moves. It's a quieter mode of character development than the show typically used, and Reedus handles it with a consistency that's easy to underestimate if you're not paying close attention. The practical effect of using real background actor performers for walkers, rather than replacing them with CGI, is one of the show's most consistent creative commitments. CGI crowds have a quality that human eyes register as wrong even when they can't quite articulate what's wrong with them. The walkers in The Walking Dead, because they're performed by people, have a physical presence in the frame that a digital substitute would lack. They interact with objects and terrain in ways that reflect actual physical weight. This seems like an obvious choice in retrospect, but it's actually quite expensive and logistically demanding, and many productions in similar circumstances would have moved toward digital augmentation much earlier. The Walking Dead's commitment to practical effects in this area gave the series a texture it would otherwise not have. The background walker performers are collectively a fairly remarkable population. Some are actors and stunt performers with substantial careers outside the show. Others are people who answered open casting calls and ended up in a recurring engagement. The makeup process that transforms them is intensive enough that the production relationship between the actors and the effects team becomes quite close over time. Spending 3 to 5 hours in someone's chair has that effect. Nicotero has spoken about the community that formed around the Walker performance work, the regulars who came back season after season, and whose physical contributions are visible across years of footage. There's also the practical challenge of directing a scene that includes hundreds of walkers alongside a featured cast. The walkers need to be coordinated, given specific movements, specific positions, specific behaviours, while the principal cast is performing and the cameras are rolling. This requires a level of choreographic planning that's more akin to staging a complex action sequence than to traditional directing. Nicotero's experience doing both the effects work and the directing gave him a specific competence in managing this that not all directors would have had. The walkers in The Walking Dead are, technically, one of the show's most consistent elements across its entire run, not because nothing changed, or quite a lot changed actually, as the production scaled up, and as the creative team's understanding of what the walkers needed to do evolved, but because they were always taken seriously as a craft problem. The person most responsible for that is Greg Nicotero. Nicotero is one of the principal makeup effects artists on the show, and he has been involved from the pilot. He's also directed a significant number of episodes across the seasons, which gives him an unusual dual relationship to the material, someone who's both making the dead and orchestrating the scenes they're in. His company, KNB EFX Group, handled the makeup effects for the show throughout its run. Before production on the pilot began, Nicotero spent considerable time with George Romero's original zombie films, Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, as a deliberate act of research and respect. He wanted to understand the visual language that had been established by those films, not to copy it exactly, but to be in conscious conversation with it. The Walking Dead's walkers would need to honour that tradition, while doing something that felt grounded and real in a specifically television way. They'd be seen in sustained close-up, in broad daylight, over and over, for years. The makeup needed to hold up under those conditions. The process of getting a background actor into full walker makeup in the early seasons took somewhere between 3 and 5 hours. Over time, the production developed faster techniques for certain levels of walker detail. Not all walkers require the same degree of prosthetic work, but the core process remained time-intensive. At the show's scale, with hundreds of background walker performers needed across a full season, the logistics of the makeup department alone are fairly staggering to think about. One of the things the creative team decided fairly early on was that walkers should decompose progressively between seasons. There was an internal logic about how long the apocalypse had been running and what that meant for the state of the dead. The walkers in Season 8 should look different, more degraded, than the walkers in Season 1. They don't always succeed at this completely, partly because continuity at that scale is genuinely difficult, but the intention was there. It's the kind of detail that most viewers never consciously register, but that contributes to the show feeling coherent. The sound design for walkers is its own distinct craft problem. There's a full section on sound coming later, but the short version is that the solution they found sounds like it came from bodies rather than from a computer, which is exactly what it needed to do. Walker casting was a genuine department. They looked specifically for actors with unusual physical qualities, particular gaits, particular ways of moving, particular builds, who could move in ways that looked genuinely wrong. Some of the most effective background walkers in the show are people you never see clearly, but whose movement registers as deeply strange even at a distance. That's a craft skill that doesn't get talked about much, the ability to make ordinary movement look wrong. Nicotero has described his approach to walker design as working from a principle of medical accuracy as a creative constraint. He engaged with the idea that decomposition follows predictable patterns. What happens to skin first? What happens to tissue over time? And use that as a framework. Some of it you can verify against reality, and some of it is necessarily impressionistic, but the commitment to the logic of it gives the walkers a physical coherence that pure imagination sometimes lacks. In later seasons, as budgets expanded and the production's ambitions grew, some of the walker makeups became extraordinarily detailed. The cave walkers in Season 10, the ones who have been in the dark for so long that they've essentially fused with the environment, are among the most complex prosthetic designs the department produced. They're also in a category of visual that I find hard to look at directly at 2 a.m, which is perhaps a recommendation or perhaps a warning depending on what you're looking for. Several crew members and writers appeared as walkers over the course of the show's run. It was considered a small honour within the production to be given a walker cameo, a background death, a featured bit of grotesque prosthetic work. Directors who had worked on the show would sometimes be spotted in the crowd if you knew to look. Greg Nicotero himself appears as a walker in multiple seasons. The Governor's Walker Aquarium, the collection of walker heads in tanks that decorates his private room in Woodbury, was one of the more technically involved set pieces in the early seasons. The floating heads were a combination of practical effects and a small amount of visual effects work, and the overall impression of them, this collection of trophies that tells you everything you need to know about the governor before he does anything, is effective in a way that's hard to separate from how well it's actually executed. The relationship between the show's production and the communities where it filmed was not always straightforward. The logistical demands of a large-scale television production, road closures, noise, large numbers of crew and equipment, the occasional controlled explosion, are substantial, and small communities don't always welcome them unconditionally. What seems to have made the Georgia locations work over the long term is a combination of the economic benefits being genuinely significant for small towns with limited other industry and a production team that was, by most accounts, considerate about the relationship. The Walking Dead became part of the local economy in those areas in a way that created genuine mutual interest in the arrangement continuing. There's also the question of what happens to these locations after production ends. The Walking Dead finished its run in 2022, but the locations it used don't simply revert to ordinary life in an entirely uncomplicated way. Senoia's downtown still has Walking Dead-themed shops and tours. The people who live there have spent a decade and more in a town that was partly a television set. Some of them were extras in the show. Some of them rented their houses to the production. Some of them watched their town become something that people drove hours to see because of something that was filmed there. That's a particular kind of local history that doesn't have many precedents. The way the show used real weather and real seasons in its filming is also worth a note. Georgia has hot summers and mild winters, but it does have genuine seasonal variation, and the production used this, the heat of summer shoots, the specific grey quality of winter light in the American South, rather than fighting it. The prison sequences in Season 3 have a quality of summer heat that you can almost feel through the screen. The farm in Season 2 has a particular autumn atmosphere. This wasn't always possible to control in the way a studio production would control it, but the show's willingness to work with what the environment offered gave those settings a naturalism that's part of what makes them feel real. Senoia. Georgia is a small town. It has a population of a few thousand people, a pleasant historic downtown, a certain quiet southern small-town atmosphere that you'd associate with that part of the state. It also has, for the better part of 15 years, been one of the primary filming locations for The Walking Dead, and that association has changed it in some fairly significant ways. The town became so central to the production that a substantial portion of the Alexandria Safe Zone, one of the show's major settings across multiple seasons, was simply Senoia's existing residential streets, dressed and maintained by the production. Rick and Michonne's house is a real house in Senoia. After the show's production era ended, fans were still visiting the house. The town built a Walking Dead museum. There are guided tours. the show's presence accumulated into something that functions almost like a permanent installation. A lot of this is downstream from Georgia's film and television tax incentive program, which offers up to 30% transferable tax credit for productions that shoot in the state. The Walking Dead kept production in Georgia for its entire run, and the financial logic of that decision is directly connected to those incentives. What began as a cost-saving measure gradually created something else, a self-sustaining regional film industry infrastructure built significantly around this one show. Crew, facilities, training pipelines, all of it accumulated in Georgia because the show was there and stayed there. The prison, one of the most important settings in seasons 3 and 4, was filmed at the West Georgia Correctional Facility in Coweta County, a real correctional facility that had been decommissioned before the production arrived. The use of an actual former prison gave the setting a weight that a constructed set might not have achieved. The existing structures, the scale of the yard, the specific quality of the light through those particular buildings, none of that needs to be manufactured if you're working in the real place. Woodbury, the town controlled by the governor in seasons 3 and 4, was filmed partly in Grantville, Georgia, which at the time of production was a fairly economically depressed small town. The show's presence brought attention and some degree of economic activity, and Grantville has since leaned into its Walking Dead association in the way that Sonoya has. Small towns in Georgia that happen to have the right visual qualities, a certain rural American atmosphere, the right mixture of buildings and open space, found that the show's production could be both a disruptive presence and a meaningful economic one. Herschel's farm from season 2 was a real working farm in Sonoya that the production rented. The farmhouse itself was used largely as found. The barn was a constructed set piece built on the farm's land. The farm became a tourist destination after it was used on the show, which is a slightly surreal outcome for a working agricultural property. The barn no longer stands, but the farmhouse does. The bridge from Rick's final episode in season 9, the one that gets blown up in the sequence that ends Andrew Lincoln's time on the show, was constructed as a temporary set in a rural area south of Atlanta. It was built specifically to be partially destroyed for filming, which is a level of production commitment to a single sequence that reflects how significant that story beat was meant to be. The road outside Sonoya, where numerous exterior scenes were filmed, has been informally referred to by locals as Dead Road for years. People drive out specifically to see it, which is a peculiar kind of pilgrimage. There's really not much to see that you couldn't find on any other rural Georgia road of that type, but the location itself has accumulated meaning from all the things that happen there on screen. Several Atlanta locations appear in the show's early seasons using their real geography, the city's actual streets and buildings standing in for the early apocalypse versions of themselves. The tank scene from the pilots was filmed in actual downtown Atlanta. That willingness to use real urban infrastructure, rather than constructing everything from scratch, gives those early episodes a grounded quality. The apocalypse looks like somewhere you could find on a map. One of the more interesting technical divergences is the show's handling of the prison, specifically the question of how long the group stays there. In the comic, the prison arc is longer and more developed in certain ways. The Woodbury community and the governor storyline are extended differently. The internal dynamics of the prison group are explored at greater length. The television version compressed some of this and expanded other parts, and the decision about which moments to slow down and which to accelerate reveals something about what the writers valued in the source material. They slowed down the character dynamics and accelerated the governor's threat, which reflects the show's consistent preference for character-driven slow burns punctuated by violent events, rather than the comic's sometimes more even distribution of those elements. The character of Michonne is handled with interesting faithfulness in broad terms and significant divergence in specifics. Her visual introduction, the armless walker companions, the katana, the essential mystery and dangerousness of her all of that translates directly. The particular shape of her backstory and her emotional arc in the television version, especially her relationship with Rick and the development of the family she builds, goes places the comic approaches somewhat differently. Gurira's version of Michonne is emotionally warmer than the comics, eventually more given to expressing attachment and vulnerability, which some comic readers find a departure from the character they knew, and others feel is an enrichment. There's also the matter of Negan's arc after his capture. In the comic, Negan is imprisoned by Rick and held for years before eventually being released. The story uses him as a long-running background presence, a question about what justice means in this world, before giving him a significant role in the Whisperer War. The television show follows this broad arc but with different pacing and different specific beat points, and the character's eventual rehabilitation, or partial rehabilitation, is handled with more explicit, dramatic attention in the series than in the comic. The Walking Dead is one of those adaptations where the source material and the television version have such different trajectories that by a certain point they're almost separate things, parallel tellings of the same premise that branch off from each other early and keep diverging. Robert Kirkman has said publicly that he considers them exactly that, two different versions of the same story, neither more or less valid than the other. I think that's the right way to think about it, and it makes the comparison between them more interesting rather than just a ledger of what was changed. The most significant early divergence is that the CDC storyline, which fills most of the first season's final episode, doesn't happen in the comic at all. Rick's group never goes to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. That entire narrative was created by Frank Darabont, who wanted a clean structural ending for the first season, a place of apparent safety that turns out to be its own kind of trap, a hope that dissolves. It works as television. It doesn't exist in the source material. Shane Walsh's extended television life is another significant divergence. In the comic, Rick kills Shane after only about 12 issues, fairly early in the story, before the farm, certainly long before the kind of extended antagonist arc that the show built around him. The television decision to keep Shane alive into a full second season, with John Bernthal given space to develop the character's psychological unravelling in detail, was driven partly by the recognition of how good Bernthal was in the role. It paid off. Shane's death in the show, when it comes, carries more weight than the comic version precisely because the show had done more work on him. Andrea in the comic is one of the most consequential departures. She survives nearly to the end of Kirkman's story, develops into a skilled long-range shooter, and becomes Rick's eventual romantic partner in the later issues. The television version of Andrea dies in season 3, in the prison, in circumstances that frustrated a significant portion of the show's audience, partly because the manner of her death felt preventable, and partly because comic readers knew what she was supposed to become. It remains one of the more debated decisions in the show's adaptation history. The Whisperer's arc, the story of the group who wear walker skins as camouflage, was adapted from the comic with relatively close fidelity. The specific horror of the concept, and particularly the line of severed heads on pikes that marks their introduction as a true threat, was reproduced on screen in a way that comic readers recognised immediately. Some things translate directly. Negan's introduction is the most famous case of close adaptation in the show's history. The Season 6 finale/Season 7 premiere sequence, the lineup, the bat, the specific dialogue, reproduced the comic source material with a degree of fidelity that was striking given how often the show had diverged before. The decision to leave the victim's identity a cliffhanger over an entire summer between seasons is not a decision from the comic. That was a television edition, and it generated enormous discussion about the ethics of that kind of deliberate audience manipulation. The comic's ending, Carl as an adult, the world rebuilt, Rick's story told as a legend, is something the television show could never directly replicate, partly because the show made different choices about which characters survived to which points, and partly because Lincoln's Rick was given a different kind of continuation. The spirit of Kirkman's ending, though, the long view, the persistence, the idea that the story doesn't end with any particular event, but with the ongoing accumulation of human life, is something the franchise has been gesturing toward in various ways ever since. What I find most interesting in the comparison is the characters, who grew more interesting on screen than they were on the page. Carol is the obvious example. Daryl doesn't exist in the comic at all. The television version of Negan, given more complexity and eventual redemption arc, arguably ended up more interesting than the comic version. And the television version of the Governor, in Season 4 especially, was given a depth that the comic version, being a more straightforwardly evil character, never quite had. The Governor storyline in Season 4 is one of the places where the television show improved on the source material in a way that's worth being direct about. The mid-season episodes that follow the Governor after his exile from Woodbury, wandering alone, encountering a new family, seeming for a moment like someone capable of genuine change, are good television and good character writing. The comic's Governor is mostly defined by what he does rather than by interiority. David Morrissey and the writers found something the comic never reached for. How someone like that happens, which is a different kind of horror than the atrocities themselves. The spin-off's relationship to the comic source material is also worth a note. None of them have a direct comic equivalent. The spin-offs are entirely television inventions, which gives them creative freedom, but also removes the scaffolding the main series had. Dead City and The Ones Who Live deal with characters and storylines developed in the television show specifically, and the result is stories that feel like continuations rather than departures. That coherence is something the franchise earned over many seasons. The dynamic between Carol and the children in the show, the way she becomes a surrogate mother figure to various young characters across the seasons, is something that the series uses to illuminate her in ways that would be impossible with adult characters. Her relationship with Sophia in the first 2 seasons, which ends in one of the show's most devastating sequences, establishes something about Carol's relationship to loss and to the limits of protection that colours everything she does afterward. The lesson the show seems to draw from Sophia's death for Carol is not that she should love less, but that she should become more capable. That's an interesting response to grief that the character then lives out across 6 or 7 seasons. The episode Infected from Season 4, where Carol is discovered to have been secretly teaching the children at the prison how to use weapons, against Rick's rules, is another significant moment in her arc, one that often gets less attention than The Grove, but that matters equally. She's been doing the thing that she believes needs doing without permission, because she's concluded that survival requires it, and that seeking permission from someone who might say no is a luxury the situation doesn't allow. That's a version of Carol who has developed a complete moral framework of her own, quite independent of the group's consensus. The question of whether she's right is one the show asks and, wisely, doesn't fully answer. What I find most interesting about Carol's final seasons is how they treat survival itself as a kind of trauma. The show had been interested in the psychological cost of what Carol had done and witnessed, and the later storylines, the retreat from people, the cottage in the woods, the difficulty of re-entering community life, are asking questions about how you live with the things you've had to do. Not everyone found those seasons compelling, and I understand why, but I think the intention behind them is serious, and McBride's performance throughout is consistent in a way that holds it together, even when the writing is less sure of itself. Carol Pelletier is, in many ways, the show's great underdog narrative, not in terms of the character, but in terms of what Melissa McBride was able to do with a role that the production itself didn't fully understand at the beginning. It's one of those stories about a performance outrunning the material that was written for it, and the writers eventually catching up and writing toward the performance they had rather than the performance they'd originally planned for. In the first season, Carol is introduced as a quiet woman in a difficult domestic situation. A husband who's abusive, a daughter she's trying to protect, a disposition that reads as passive and almost deliberately unmemorable. In the comic, as mentioned, Carol's arc ends relatively early and relatively badly. There was no particular reason, at the point of her introduction in the television show, to expect her story to become what it became. McBride has been fairly open about the fact that at various points across the show's run, she was told, or understood, that Carol's survival into future seasons wasn't guaranteed, that she could be written out at any time, and that she should be prepared for that possibility. She carried the character through that uncertainty with a consistency that's remarkable in retrospect. She treated Carol as a full person, even in the episodes where Carol was being used primarily as a supporting element in someone else's story. The transformation of Carol into a tactical survivor, and eventually into one of the show's most formidable characters, was driven by the response to McBride's earlier work. The writer's room was watching what she was doing, with limited material, and adjusting accordingly. By season 3 and 4, Carol's capabilities had expanded significantly, and the show was starting to build stories specifically around her. The episode The Grove from season 4 is frequently cited as one of the best single episodes in the show's entire run. It centres on Carol having to make a devastating decision about a child under her care, and it puts McBride in a position of having to carry essentially the entire emotional weight of the episode. She does it with a restraint that's rather affecting. The scene doesn't ask you to watch someone perform grief. It asks you to watch someone absorb something unabsorbable and keep going. McBride has said she found the episode too difficult to read aloud, at the table read with the full cast. She processed it alone first. Carol's season 5 arc, the infiltration and destruction of Terminus, was in part a response to audience frustration that a character who had demonstrated her capability wasn't being used enough. She arrives alone, in disguise, and essentially rescues everyone. It's a proper action sequence built around a character who'd been a quietly domestic presence in season 1. The show earned that moment, I think, through the patient work of the preceding seasons. The later seasons took Carol in a more inward direction, a withdrawal from other people, a pulling back from the community life she'd been part of. Whether this worked as well as the earlier transformations is a question reasonable people can disagree on, but the intent seems to have been a thoughtful one. What does survival cost over time, and where does someone go when they've spent years being the person who does the terrible necessary things? Those are good questions for the show to be asking, even if the execution was uneven. McBride's initial non-appearance in the Daryl Dixon spin-off and the public discussion around that decision was an uncomfortable episode in the franchise's later history. She had been attached to the spin-off and then withdrew. The announcement was made publicly, and there was significant fan response. She subsequently rejoined. The specifics of what happened during that period were never made fully public, but the whole sequence of events was a reminder of how deeply invested the audience had become in both the character and the performer. The death of Herschel in the season 4 mid-season finale, the governor beheading him with Michonne's sword in front of the assembled prison and Woodbury groups, is, for many viewers, the show at its most unapologetically devastating. Not because it's the most violent death the show ever staged, but because Herschel had been built so carefully across so many seasons into a figure of genuine moral authority and compassion, and because Scott Wilson played him with such quiet dignity that losing him felt like losing something the world of the show genuinely needed. The scene is edited so that you're not quite sure whether to believe it's happening until it's done. That uncertainty, that fraction of a second hope, is what makes it work. Tyrese's death in season 5, a slow fever dream sequence that's unlike anything else in the show, is an interesting case of the production departing from its own visual grammar in service of something more expressionistic. The sequence in which Tyrese hallucinates the dead while the living work to save him is, by the show's usual standards, quite strange. It's more concerned with what's happening inside a dying person's mind than with any external event. Chad Coleman's performance in that final sequence is one of the more overlooked pieces of acting in the show's history, I think. Abraham Ford's death, which as noted occurs in the same scene as Glenn's just before it, deserves a separate mention. Michael Cudlitz spent 2 seasons building Abraham into one of the show's most vivid presences, loud, funny, committed to an almost aggressive optimism, the kind of person who uses extroversion as armour over something more uncertain. His final line, delivered directly to Negan before the bat comes down, became immediately one of the most quoted in the show's history. It's perfectly in character, defiant and slightly surreal and in some sense triumphant, which is a very hard thing to pull off in that context. The deaths that didn't happen are also worth a moment. Daryl's survival, as mentioned, was a recurring near miss, but there were others, characters who the production or the writer's room considered killing at various points, and then didn't, sometimes because of performance quality, sometimes because the story found a better use for them, sometimes simply because the right moment for the death hadn't arrived yet. The accumulation of these decisions is part of what makes a long-running show's relationship to its own cast complicated and interesting. Survival on screen is itself a kind of decision, made repeatedly, that tells you something about what the people making the show value. The Walking Dead made a deliberate practice of killing central characters. This was part of Kirkman's original philosophy. The idea that no one was safe was supposed to generate a specific quality of narrative tension. If the story could take anyone, at any time, every scene carries a different kind of weight. You pay attention differently. I think this worked very effectively in the early seasons, and I think it became progressively less effective as the show continued, for reasons that are interesting to examine. Shane Walsh's extended arc and his eventual death in Season 2 is a useful case study. John Bernthal's performance in that role is one of the finest things in the show's run. The character's disintegration, the way he moves from Rick's best friend into something recognisable as a villain without ever quite losing his specific justifications for his own behaviour, is sophisticated character work. His death felt earned and right and properly painful. Frank Darabont had pushed to keep him around beyond the comic's timeline because the performance warranted it, and he was correct. Glenn Rhee's death in the Season 7 premiere is the episode the show is most discussed in relation to, probably. The setup was extensive. The Season 6 finale's cliffhanger, the summer of speculation, the deliberate concealment of the victim's identity, and the execution was extremely difficult to watch. Stephen Yeun had known for some time before filming that the character would be killed, and had to maintain that information through the long public gap between the cliffhanger and the resolution. The decision to kill Abraham before Glenn in the same sequence was a late creative addition, intended to raise the stakes by making the audience feel briefly that Negan's choice had already been made, before he then made it again. Abraham's death in that sequence is sometimes underrated in the discussion of that episode, I think, because Glenn's follows it. Michael Cudlitz's final scenes are rather extraordinary. Andrew Lincoln's departure from the show in Season 9 was handled in a way that prioritised the possibility of continuation. Rick's apparent death at the bridge was filmed to leave the character's fate technically open, and the creative team had already developed the outlines of a future story. Lincoln has said the decision to leave was significantly driven by the difficulty of living away from his family in England for extended periods. He relocated to England from the United States during the show's run, and the commuting was becoming untenable. The departure of the show's central character after 9 seasons was a significant event, and the show navigated it by essentially reframing rather than resolving. Carl Grimes' death in Season 8 was genuinely controversial, and in a different way than most Walking Dead deaths. Chandler Riggs had been on the show since childhood. Carl's death in the comic doesn't happen. He survives to adulthood and is a significant presence in the story's final chapters. The television decision to kill him was one that Riggs spoke about publicly, and the fan response was protective in a way that went beyond the usual audience investment in a character. People were, in some sense, looking out for Riggs, the actual person who'd grown up in front of them. It's a slightly unusual emotional dynamic. Scott Wilson, who played Herschel, one of the most genuinely beloved characters in the show's history, died in real life on October 6, 2018. Production was in the middle of filming at the time. The cast and crew's grief was real, and the response from the show's audience was correspondingly warm and extensive. Herschel's death on screen, in the season 4 mid-season finale, had already been one of the show's most painful moments. The real-life loss of Wilson gave that earlier loss a different kind of resonance. Lauren Cohan's departure and eventual return is one of the more complicated stories in the show's casting history. Her contract negotiations became public in 2018. She left to appear in another series, and the show wrote Maggie's absence into the story with an in-universe explanation. She subsequently returned. The gap in Maggie's timeline, the years of unexplained absence, was eventually addressed in the show's final seasons, and her character's continuation in Dead City gave the arc a proper continuation. The pattern of significant character deaths became less effective, I think, as the show went on. The mechanism of it, the shock of losing someone the audience cared about, requires that the audience has built up a genuine store of investment and trust. When that trust starts to erode through too many deaths or deaths that feel arbitrary rather than meaningful, the mechanism doesn't work the same way. The audience learns not to invest fully as a protective response, which is, ironically, exactly what a survivor in a zombie apocalypse would do. The show's relationship to its comic reading audience shaped its cultural reach in ways that are easy to underestimate. At peak viewership, The Walking Dead fandom was a combination of people who knew the comics well, people who were entirely new to the story, and everything in between. This is an interesting audience composition to write for, because the comic readers came in with expectations and foreknowledge, while the new viewers had none. The show had to work as both continuation and discovery simultaneously, and the most successful seasons managed exactly that. They satisfied comic readers by adapting the source material faithfully enough to feel like a recognizable version, while telling the story in a way that worked for people who'd never read a page of it. That's a more difficult balance than it sounds. The social media dimension of the show's peak years was significant. Twitter conversations on Sunday nights during Walking Dead seasons were a specific cultural phenomenon, a real-time communal response to the episodes that extended the viewing experience beyond the episode itself. Trending topics, immediate memes, heated discussions about character decisions. The show was, in that specific period, genuinely appointment television in the older sense, something you watched when it aired because the conversation around it was part of the experience, and watching it later meant being left out. That quality of communal, simultaneous experience is fairly rare in television, even in its most successful moments, and Walking Dead had it for several years at its peak. The franchise's merchandise program deserves a bit more attention than it sometimes gets in discussions of the show's impact. The action figures, the trading cards, the graphic novel collections, the video game adaptations, these represent an engagement with the franchise that goes beyond passive viewership. People who collect Walking Dead merchandise or play the Telltale games are not just watching the show, they're maintaining an ongoing active relationship with the world. That kind of deep engagement is what turns a popular program into a franchise with genuine longevity. The Telltale games are worth one more mention here, because I think they're sometimes treated as a peripheral part of the franchise when they're actually one of its finest expressions. The first season of the game won more awards in 2012 than any other game of that year. A video game beat everything else that year. That's a remarkable outcome for a licensed tie-in product, and it happened because Telltale, particularly the writer and designer Sean Vanneman, who led the creative work on the first season, approached the material with genuine artistic seriousness. Lee and Clementine are characters who stand alongside the best characters in the franchise's history, which is a strong claim, but one that the work supports. If you want to understand what The Walking Dead is capable of at its emotional peak, the first season of the Telltale game is as good a place to look as any episode of the television series. The show's influence on the zombie genre more broadly is worth acknowledging. There had been zombie films and a small number of zombie television projects before The Walking Dead, but nothing that had treated the genre as a vehicle for long-form character drama in the way the show did. The success of the show encouraged other productions to approach horror genre premises with the kind of investment in character and world building that had previously been reserved for prestige drama. The genre changed around the show's existence, and while correlation and causation are always tricky, the timing is suggestive. On October 12th, 2014, the Season 5 premiere of The Walking Dead, an episode called No Sanctuary, was watched by 17,290,000 people on the same evening it aired. That number made it the most watched episode of any drama series in the history of basic cable television, not just the most watched episode of The Walking Dead. At its peak, The Walking Dead's cultural presence was substantial in a way that's slightly difficult to convey to someone who wasn't around during those years. The companion program Talking Dead, a live after-show hosted by Chris Hardwick, featuring cast members and celebrity fans discussing the just-aired episode, was itself a modest ratings success, which is an unusual thing for a post-show program to be. The ritual of watching the episode and then watching Talking Dead was a significant weekly event for a particular kind of dedicated viewer. The video game adaptation by Telltale Games is worth a considerable mention. Released in 2012, it followed an original character named Lee Everett protecting a child named Clementine through the early apocalypse. It had nothing to do with the show's characters or story. It was entirely its own narrative, set in the same world. It won several Game of the Year awards. It's still considered one of the finest narrative games ever made, and its emotional clarity in the relationship between Lee and Clementine is something the show itself was reaching for in its best moments. If you haven't played it, the recommendation stands. Telltale continued the story across multiple seasons, following Clementine's development from a small child into a young adult navigating the same world. The game's relationship to the show's franchise was interesting, licensed but genuinely independent, using the setting without deferring to the television canon. They're rather remarkable pieces of work. Universal Studios added Walking Dead attractions at multiple parks, walk-through experiences, haunted houses, character meet and greets. The merchandise program extended to action figures, board games, branded escape rooms, Halloween costumes. The show generated a licensing infrastructure around itself that became significant in its own right. The ratings decline after Season 7 is well documented and was the subject of considerable discussion at the time and since. The drop was steep and it happened quickly, from the peak viewership of the mid-series years to audiences that were, by the final seasons, a fraction of that. This is often attributed to specific creative decisions: the Glenn death and its execution, the prolonged all-out war arc, the departure of Andrew Lincoln. But the full story is probably more complicated than any single cause. What's most interesting about it is how rapid it was. From peak to significantly diminished viewership happened in a relatively short span of seasons. Despite the domestic American viewership decline, international audiences remained more consistent through the later seasons. The show continued to perform strongly in European markets particularly, and this international strength influenced some of the spin-off decisions. The Daryl Dixon series being filmed in France, for instance, was partly a reflection of the franchise's European audience. Dead City's New York setting was partly chosen for its international recognizability. The Walking Dead's cultural legacy is difficult to precisely measure, but its influence on the landscape of prestige cable drama is significant. It proved that genre television, horror specifically, could attract the kind of simultaneous mass viewership that had been associated with prestige drama or network procedurals. It opened a door, essentially, through which a great deal of subsequent genre television has walked. There's a prop I haven't mentioned yet that might be the one with the most story weight attached to it. The photograph of Laurie and Carl that Rick takes from the house in the pilot and carries with him. It's a small thing, a family photo, battered and worn, and it reappears throughout the early seasons as a physical anchor to the life Rick is trying to hold on to or return to. Props that carry that kind of accumulated emotional significance are rare, and they tend to work because the performance around them is consistent. Lincoln treated the photograph the same way across multiple seasons, which is the kind of continuity that audiences absorb without necessarily noticing. The armour and protective gear worn by various communities as the seasons progressed, the makeshift padding of the saviours, the more polished gear of the CRM in the spin-offs, tells a story about access to resources and the sophistication of different groups' manufacturing capabilities. The costume department built a visual language of world building into the clothing that reflects the social and economic hierarchy of the show's communities. Alexandria's relatively clean and maintained clothing signals its relative stability. The CRM's military standard uniform signals something about the scale and organisation of what they represent. Negan's leather jacket is a prop costume that functions similarly to Rick's hat and Michonne's katana. It's a visual shorthand for the character, an instantly recognisable element of his identity that the show uses to signal his presence. When characters in later seasons wear or reference the jacket, it's working as a piece of shorthand that carries all the accumulated meaning of the character's history. Jeffrey Dean Morgan has spoken about how the jacket felt like it completed the character for him when he first put it on. One of those costume moments where the clothing tells the actor something about who they're playing. Rick's sheriff's hat is probably the most iconic single prop in the show's history. The kind of prop that functions almost as a symbol. The hat as the idea of the old world, the idea of order and authority, worn by someone trying to hold on to those things in a context where they barely apply anymore. It was sourced, as mentioned earlier, from actual Georgia Sheriff's Department surplus, acquired in multiple duplicates for the production run. The hat's various states of wear across the seasons form their own quiet visual record of how long Rick had been carrying the weight of it. Negan's barbed wire baseball bat, Lucille, was built by the production's armory department and exists in several screen-used versions. The name comes from the comic, where Negan names the bat after his deceased wife. It's a detail that gives the weapon a strange tenderness alongside its violence, which is very consistent with how Negan is written. Jeffrey Dean Morgan kept one of the screen-used Lucille's after production. He's been photographed with it at conventions and public appearances. It's one of those props that's inseparable from the performance associated with it. Michonne's katana is another prop that carries significant weight. It was custom built by the production's armory, and Danai Gurira trained extensively with it. She was insistent that the character's physical relationship with the sword should feel authentic, not like a stage prop being wielded carefully. The way Gurira moves with the katana in her scenes, particularly in the first few seasons, is one of the small pleasures of watching Michonne closely. There's actual practice in it. Rick's sidearm, a Colt Python .357 Magnum, the revolver that appears in almost every scene of the early seasons, was a deliberate nod to the comic, where Kirkman specifically chose that model for Rick's weapon and drew it consistently. The television production maintained that choice, which is a pleasing detail of fidelity. It's not the most practical choice for a post-apocalyptic firearm, arguably. The ammunition is less common than 9mm, but it's the right choice for the character. The aging of costumes was handled by a dedicated department whose job was to progressively distress, stain, and wear down the characters' clothing between seasons. In a world without regular access to clean clothes or laundry, the garments should look lived in increasingly extreme ways. The cumulative effect of this across multiple seasons, watching the costume condition deteriorate in parallel with everything else, is one of those visual storytelling techniques that works below the level of conscious awareness. You don't notice it as a technique, you just feel the weight of the world more. The RV that Dale drives in the early seasons, and which serves as a mobile home base for the group, was a 1973 Winnebago Chieftain. The production team maintained it throughout filming, and it functioned as an actual set piece with an actual mechanical history. It needed maintenance and repair the way a real 30-year-old RV would. There's something appropriate about that, the vehicle that becomes a symbol of the group's fragile continuity being itself fragile and in constant need of attention. The Alexandria Safe Zone set, built as a partial standing exterior with real houses in Sonoya, was one of the most elaborately maintained standing sets in the production's history. It was used across multiple seasons and required ongoing upkeep as it appeared in different seasonal conditions, different states of the story's world. The production's relationship with Sonoya as a filming location meant that the town's actual architecture became part of the show's visual language in a way that blurred the boundary between constructed set and real place. The Governor's Walker Aquarium is worth a moment of specific attention as a production achievement. The floating heads in tanks are a combination of practical effects, prosthetic heads with various mechanisms to maintain their position and movement, and a small amount of visual effects enhancement. What makes the aquarium work as a set piece is what it communicates about the Governor before he does anything. This is a person who collects this, who lives with this, who finds this arrangement aesthetically satisfying. Its character revealed through prop. McCreary's use of voices, human voices used as melodic instruments rather than as lyrics, is another consistent element of the score that gives it a quality unlike most television drama scoring. There are tracks in the Walking Dead score that feel genuinely ancient, like something that might have been sung around a fire long before any of the show's events, which is an unusual emotional register for a contemporary zombie drama to be evoking. It's this quality that makes the music feel appropriate to the show's interest in permanence and loss. It sounds like it predates whatever's happening on screen and will continue after it ends. The specific musical themes associated with the group, the collection of characters who function as the show's central family across the seasons, develop and transform as the group's composition changes. McCreary tracks these changes musically in ways that reward close listening. When characters leave or die, the harmonic resolution of their associated themes shifts in subtle ways. When new characters are integrated into the group's emotional core, their musical material begins to interact with the group's established themes. It's a fairly sophisticated piece of long-form thematic development for a television score, and it happens largely below the level of conscious awareness for most viewers. There's also the particular use McCreary makes of the banjo and American folk idiom in certain episodes set in specific places. The farm episodes in Season 2 have a sonic texture that's rooted in Southern American folk music, not in a heavy-handed way, not as obvious atmosphere setting, but as a thread running under the score that places those episodes in a very specific cultural and geographic space. The prison sequences, by contrast, have a different quality, something more contained and metallic, reflecting the hard geometry of that environment. The score responds to setting in ways that demonstrate McCreary thinking about each location as a distinct sonic world. The Walking Dead sound team was nominated for Emmy Awards multiple times across the show's run, and the sound editing and mixing in particularly ambitious episodes, the Walker Siege sequences, the large-scale battle episodes, involved a scale of work that doesn't get discussed as much as it should. The ambient sound design of the world, the particular quality of silence in a post-industrial landscape, The way close-quarter walker scenes were built from very specific layered sounds, all of this contributes to the show's overall texture in ways that are easy to take for granted until you think about how wrong it would feel if any element of it were removed. Bear McCreary has been composing music for The Walking Dead since the pilot, and his approach to the show's score is one of those creative choices that shape the texture of the whole thing in ways most people don't consciously register, but would immediately notice if it were gone. The central decision McCreary made was to build the score from acoustic instruments, guitars, strings, piano, voices, rather than from the kind of heavy orchestral sound that horror television often defaults to. He's described the principle as wanting music that sounds like survivors made it, something handmade, fragile, specifically human. The idea being that in a world stripped of most of its production capacity, music would still exist, but it would sound like it came from people, rather than from studios. That's an unusual approach for a genre score, and it gives the show a warmth that the material itself would otherwise lack. The main theme, the repeated guitar figure that opens the show, was something McCreary arrived at quickly. He's described thinking of it almost immediately when he engaged with the material. It was designed to feel like memory, or like something heard from a distance and imperfectly recalled. It has a slightly mournful quality that isn't tragic exactly, more elegiac, something ending but quietly. When significant characters died, McCreary would write specific musical responses, pieces that referenced the characters' existing musical themes, but resolved differently. This became one of the score's most emotionally effective techniques. If you've been listening to a particular melodic motif associated with a character across multiple seasons, hearing that motif arrive at a different kind of cadence at the moment of their death carries a weight that's difficult to manufacture through other means. The episode The Grove, which we discussed in the Carol section, is one of the most carefully considered examples of McCreary's musical restraint. The score in that episode is almost entirely absent through the episode's most significant sequences. The silence is not emptiness, it's a choice. The absence of music forces the audience to be present with the scene in a more unmediated way than scoring it would allow. McCreary has cited it as one of his most deliberate decisions on the whole series. The Walker soundscape was built by the sound department separately from the score. It's a distinct craft problem, designing sound for creatures that are technically human, but whose vocalizations have changed into something else. The solution they arrived at, layering animal recordings with electronic processing, produces something that feels genuinely organic in a way that purely synthesized sound tends not to. The pigs and horses that make up a significant part of the Walker soundscape are never identifiable as pigs and horses. What you hear is something in between, something that registers as wrongness before it registers as any specific sound. McCreary returned for several of the spin-off series, which maintained a sonic continuity across the expanding franchise. His work on The Ones Who Live was noted for a different quality than the main series, more contained, more claustrophobic, reflecting the specific circumstances of Rick's situation inside the CRM. The franchise's musical identity has stayed coherent in a way that some of its visual and narrative elements have not, and that's largely McCreary's consistency over nearly 15 years of work in the same world. What's interesting about the spin-off strategy as a whole is that it represents a fundamentally different approach to franchise extension than, say, the Marvel model. Rather than expanding the mythology through new characters connected to an existing central universe, The Walking Dead spin-offs take existing characters and transplant them into new contexts. Daryl goes to France, Maggie and Negan go to New York, Rick and Michonne go to Philadelphia. Each spin-off is defined by its lead character's existing relationship with the audience, rather than by a new character building that relationship from scratch. This means the emotional investment is transferable. Viewers come to Dead City because they care about Maggie and Negan, not because they're interested in the premise of Manhattan Walkers. The premise is the vehicle. The characters are the content. Whether this model is more or less sustainable than the alternative is an open question. It depends on the characters remaining interesting in new contexts, which they have so far, at least intermittently. It also depends on the performers maintaining their investment in the roles, which for Lincoln and Guerrera and Reedus and Cohan and Morgan has so far remained genuine. The Daryl Dixon spin-off's decision to make the French locations feel genuinely culturally specific, to give France an identity beyond just being a visual novelty, is one of its more interesting creative choices. The French characters, the French language, the French community dynamics are not just backdrop. They're part of the story's argument about what the post-apocalyptic world looks like in different cultural contexts, and how an American character's specific set of assumptions and skills does and doesn't translate. Daryl's survivalism, his independence, his communication style, these things read differently against French community structures than they did against Georgia survivalism, and the show uses that difference productively. One detail about The Ones Who Live that I think mattered more than it might seem: the decision to make it a limited series, 6 episodes, a defined endpoint, rather than an ongoing continuation, was significant. It meant the story had to earn its resolution, rather than continuing until the network decided to stop it. The result is a tighter, more purposeful piece of storytelling than an open-ended continuation would likely have been. Both Lincoln and Guerrera had input into that structural decision, as well as into the content of the scripts, which explains some of the emotional precision the series achieves. Fear the Walking Dead began in 2015, and it was conceived as a companion series that would do something the flagship show structurally couldn't: show the actual beginning of the outbreak. The Walking Dead drops viewers into a world already well into collapse. Rick wakes up from a coma and has to be told that things are bad now, and the audience has to take that on faith. Fear promised a thing we'd never seen: the first days, the disorientation of the world going wrong before anyone had a framework for what was happening. The West Coast setting, primarily around Los Angeles in the early seasons, gave it a distinct visual identity from the Georgia and Virginia geography of the main show. The light was different, the landscape was different, the social texture was different. This worked well in the first season and a half, and then the show had an identity problem that took several seasons to resolve. It wasn't clear what it was supposed to be once it had shown the outbreak, once the premise's unique selling point had been delivered. Fear the Walking Dead eventually became the home for Morgan Jones after his departure from the flagship series, which required a mid-series retooling and a geographic relocation that the show used to effectively reboot its focus. It ran for 8 seasons and ended in 2023, which means it outlasted the original series by a year and significantly outlived early expectations. By its final seasons, it had moved quite far from its original premise, geographically, narratively, in terms of its cast, and had become something different from what it started as. Whether that's a good thing is a genuine question. The Walking Dead Dead City, which focuses on Maggie and Negan in a Manhattan overrun with walkers, was notable partly for being the first Walking Dead property to film extensively on location in New York City. The logistics of staging walker scenes on actual Manhattan streets, securing locations, coordinating background performers in full prosthetic makeup, managing public visibility in one of the most densely populated cities in the world, were considerable. The result has a visual texture that the franchise had never quite had before. New York in decay has a specific quality, a sense of scale and recognizability that feels different from rural Georgia or the CRM's contained world. The Walking Dead, Daryl Dixon moved the franchise's most popular character to France, which was a genuinely unusual creative choice. The logic of it, putting an English-speaking lone survivor in a foreign language country, creates specific narrative constraints and social dynamics that you couldn't generate in an American setting. makes a certain sense. It also opened the franchise to a genuinely European production context. French cast, French crew, French locations. The show's visual identity is notably different from anything else in the franchise, which was presumably the point. Norman Reedus filming in France for extended periods is a specific kind of logistical and personal commitment for an actor who'd spent the previous decade in Georgia, and his engagement with the material seems genuine. The Daryl Dixon spin-off was confirmed for additional seasons before the first had finished airing, which reflects AMC's confidence in the property. The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live reunited Andrew Lincoln and Danai Gurira, Rick and Michonne, for a 6-episode limited series focused on the CRM storyline that had been building since Rick's apparent death at the bridge. It was among the most anticipated returns in the franchise's history, perhaps the most anticipated, and both Lincoln and Gurira had significant creative input into the scripts and how their characters' reunion would be told. Lincoln has said the decision to return came down to the quality of the material. He wanted Rick's story to be continued properly rather than hastily. The series introduced the Civic Republic military as a fully realized organization with internal factions and politics, which expanded the franchise's world in directions the main series had only gestured toward. The franchise's current shape, multiple concurrent and planned spin-offs, each following different characters in different parts of the world, is unusual in the history of television. It resembles, in some ways, the structure of a shared universe in film, a central mythology with multiple simultaneous expressions. Whether this model can sustain itself over the long term is an open question. The question of what The Walking Dead would have looked like if Frank Darabont had remained in charge beyond the first season is one of those counterfactuals that genuinely resists resolution. Not because the show that was made without him was obviously better or worse. It was, across its run, both things at different times, but because Darabont's aesthetic sensibility was specific and consistent in ways that gave the first season its particular quality, and removing that sensibility changed the show in ways that were probably inevitable and possibly not entirely regrettable, but that were significant. The Walking Dead had at least 4 distinct creative voices as showrunner over its 11 seasons: Darabont, Glenn Mazzara, Scott Gimple, Angela Kang, and each of them shaped it differently. That's a lot of creative identity changes for a single, long-running series. The lawsuit between Darabont and AMC, which eventually settled, centered on his compensation from the show's success after his firing. The specific details of the settlement are private, but the existence of the dispute and its eventual resolution is part of the show's legal history. Darabont has rarely spoken warmly about his experience with the network in the years since, and the split represents one of the more uncomfortable episodes in the show's production history. The show's writer's room is another element of production history that doesn't get as much attention as the cast and directors. Several writers who worked on the show have subsequently talked about the experience in interviews, and the picture that emerges is of a room that was, at its best, highly collaborative, and at its worst, somewhat chaotic. The quality of the writing across the series is variable enough that you can trace the effects of different room compositions and different creative priorities in the episodes themselves, if you're paying attention. There's a version of The Walking Dead that Frank Darabont made, or was making, before he was fired by AMC after the first season. We don't have access to all of it. The lawsuit and the settlement that followed meant that certain details stayed private, but from what's been discussed publicly, Darabont's creative vision for the second season was substantially different from what was ultimately produced. His instinct was toward a more contained, more character-focused approach. The claustrophobia and intimacy of Herschel's farm was partly his vision, and some of what ended up on screen in Season 2 does reflect that. But the extended runtime, the pacing decisions, the particular shape of what Season 2 became, that was shaped by a different person working with Darabont's outline. Morgan and Dwayne's introduction in the pilot had scenes that were slightly longer in earlier cuts. Lenny James has mentioned a deleted scene involving Morgan's wife Jenny as a walker in more detail than what made the final edit. It was apparently one of the most emotionally intense things he filmed for the character. Its removal was a pacing decision, but the emotional residue of it seems to have informed James's performance throughout. Daryl Dixon's potential death was discussed in the writer's room multiple times, not just in the later seasons, but as early as season 3. The creative team was aware of the audience's investment, and it became a genuine factor in the decision-making. You could read this as the audience limiting the show's freedom, which is one perspective, or you could read it as the show appropriately recognizing that Daryl's continued presence was one of its most valuable assets, which is another. Both are probably true simultaneously. The all-out war storyline, the extended conflict between Rick's group and the Saviors that fills seasons 7 and 8, was apparently substantially reshaped multiple times during production. The storyline in the comics covers a significant span of issues and has a fairly clear structural shape. The television version felt to many viewers like it was expanded beyond what the material could support. There's a version of those seasons, presumably, that was tighter and moved faster, and it's one of the more significant what could have been questions in the show's later history. Carl Grimes was supposed to have a longer story. The comic makes this explicitly clear. His arc through to adulthood is central to Kirkman's vision of what the story was ultimately about. The decision to kill him in the television version, in season 8, closed off a narrative direction that had been open since the show began. What season 9 and beyond might have looked like with Carl present, with a show built partly around the question of what the world looks like to the next generation, is something we can only speculate about. Deleted scenes from various seasons have surfaced over the years through DVD releases and online discussions, and they reveal the usual things that deleted scenes reveal: alternative character moments, slightly different tonal choices, scenes that were cut for length or for flow rather than because they were unsuccessful. The season 9 premiere, which had to absorb the loss of Andrew Lincoln's Rick while already being in production, apparently required significant reworking. Several storylines that had been written with Rick's continued presence in mind needed to be redistributed across other characters. Angela Kang, who became showrunner from season 9, was by most accounts a stabilizing creative presence after the more turbulent later Gimple years. The show under her stewardship, seasons 9 and 10 especially, recovered a degree of character focus and narrative coherence that had been harder to find in seasons 7 and 8. Her willingness to slow things down, to spend time in scenes that weren't plot functional but character functional, gave the final years of the main series a quality that the middle years had sometimes lacked. Season 10 in particular has several episodes that I think are as good as anything the show made since its early peak. The pandemic production challenges that affected the final stretch of that season. Several episodes were delayed by months, made its completion feel like its own kind of achievement. The show maintained an extraordinarily consistent crew throughout its production history in Georgia. The same cinematographers, directors of photography, and production designers worked on it for years, accumulating an institutional knowledge of the show's visual grammar and practical requirements that's genuinely rare in long-running television. That consistency of craft, below the level of what audiences typically discuss, is part of what kept the show looking good, even in seasons when the critical response to the writing was less enthusiastic. The show always maintained, apparently, some version of an emergency ending, a plan that could be deployed if the series was unexpectedly cancelled or if the production needed to wrap quickly. The existence of this has been mentioned, but its contents never disclosed. It's one of those production details that's interesting purely as a concept. The idea of a story always carrying an exit strategy somewhere in its infrastructure, ready to be used if needed. The final season, season 11, ran for 24 episodes across roughly 2 years, which is an unusual structural choice. It was divided into 3 parts, each released over different periods, which gave the end of the show a slightly fragmented quality. The first part was largely about a new survival challenge and new communities. The second introduced the Commonwealth in earnest. The third resolved the major storylines in ways that were, depending on your perspective, satisfying or merely adequate. The Commonwealth arc, the large functioning city with its own social hierarchy and political tensions, was one of the show's last major plot engines, and the critical response to it was mixed in ways that reflected the broader mixed feelings about the show's later years. What the final season did well, I think, was give its remaining characters moments that felt earned, not resolutions exactly, but resting points that acknowledged the journey. Carol's final trajectory, Daryl's departure from the world he'd known, the community's survival. These were handled with more care than some of the mid-run seasons had managed. It wasn't the ending the show would have had at its creative peak, but it was a real ending, which is not nothing. Kirkman's note at the back of the comic's final issue is, I think, one of the more genuinely moving pieces of writing associated with the franchise. He talks about the difficulty of ending something that's been part of your life for so long. The way stories don't want to end because there's always another chapter that could exist, and the decision to stop anyway, because the story was complete and prolonging, it would be its own kind of failure. It's a writer talking honestly about what it means to finish something, and it resonates beyond the specific context of the comic. The series finale of The Walking Dead aired on November 20th, 2022, after 11 seasons. The episode was called Rest in Peace, Ibitsi, which is a title that does its work fairly directly. The viewership for that final episode was approximately 1.4 million people, a very long distance from the 17 million who watched the season 5 premiere. That gap is one of the more striking numbers in the show's history, but I want to be careful about how much weight to put on those numbers as a verdict, because viewership figures in 2022 measure something genuinely different from viewership figures in 2014. Streaming fragmentation, time shifting, international platforms. The landscape had changed around the show, as well as the show itself having changed. The people who watched the finale were, in many cases, the most committed audience the show had, the ones who had stayed through everything, through the seasons that lost the plot and then partially found it again, through the departures and the spin-offs and the long diminishment. 1.4 million committed viewers watched it through to the end, which is its own kind of statement. Robert Kirkman ended the comic 3 years before the show's finale in July 2019, and he did it, as mentioned, without announcement. The readers found out the story was complete when they read the final page and the letter at the back explaining it. There's a consistency in that gesture with the whole philosophy of the comic. Kirkman had always said the whole point was that life doesn't resolve neatly, that it keeps going until it stops, and ending the story. The way the story ended, things felt true to that. The franchise, of course, continues, the spin-offs are ongoing, new ones are in development, the world of The Walking Dead has no particular ending in sight. Rick Grimes found Michonne. Daryl is in France, Maggie and Negan are in Manhattan. The Dead walk, in various iterations, across multiple productions simultaneously. It's quite a thing to have started from a modestly selling, independent comic in 2003, a comic that Kirkman had to lie about slightly to get anyone interested in the first place. There's something rather satisfying about that origin story, I think. The whole thing began with a slightly desperate pitch, a fabricated manga, and 7,000 copies sold in a small corner of the comics world. And then somehow, eventually, a whole generation of people made it part of their Sunday nights. What's perhaps most interesting about the franchise's current state is that it seems to have found a model that sustains it even without the flagship show. The flagship was always the thing that gave the spin-offs their gravity. You watched Fear the Walking Dead because you cared about the world that The Walking Dead had built. Now that the original series has ended, the spin-offs have to generate their own gravity. The early evidence suggests they can, at least for the audience that remains. Dead City found an audience. The Ones Who Live found a significant one. Daryl Dixon found one in a different country, almost literally. The brand has outlasted its origin in a way that not many franchises manage. Since we're spending time in this world, it feels right to mention a handful of specific episodes that stand apart from the rest, not necessarily the most action-heavy or plot-consequential, but the ones that do something unusual or particularly well, the ones that demonstrate what the show was capable of at its best. Days Gone By is the pilot, and we've talked about it at length, but it's worth naming explicitly as an achievement. Watch it as a standalone piece of television, divorced from everything that followed, and it holds up as something careful and confident and genuinely unusual. Pretty Much Dead Already, the Season 2 mid-season finale, is the episode where the barn secret is resolved. Everything that season had been building toward, the question of what Herschel was keeping in the barn and why, arrives at an answer that the show could have fumbled and didn't. The final sequence is one of the show's most painful, and it's made more painful by how completely you understand every person's response to it. Clear, from Season 3, sends Rick, Michonne and Carl back to King County to look for weapons and reunites them with Morgan, who has been alone since the pilot and has become someone recognisably different. The episode is essentially a chamber piece, 3 characters and a man they find who is barely holding on. And it's one of the most precisely written things the show ever produced. The conversation between Rick and Morgan in the final act is excellent. Too Far Gone, the Season 4 mid-season finale, the episode where the governor attacks the prison, is the show at its most classical, in a certain sense. It's a large-scale action sequence, built on top of a properly earned emotional confrontation, and it delivers on both. Herschel dies in this episode. The prison arc ends, the group scatters. It's one of the cleanest structural episodes the show made, and the emotional cost of it is genuine. The Grove from Season 4 we've discussed, but it belongs on any list of this kind. Written by Scott Gimple, directed by Michael Satrazemis. The conversation between Carol and Tyrese at the end of the episode, after the worst of it has happened, is about as quiet and devastating as television gets. No Sanctuary, the Season 5 premiere, is the one that drew those record-breaking numbers, and it earns them. After a summer of genuine uncertainty about how the group would escape Terminus, the answer comes in the first 10 minutes, and it's satisfying in the specific way that action sequences are satisfying when they're built on properly established stakes. Here's Not Here, also from Season 5, is the 90-minute Morgan origin episode, the story of how he came back from the psychological edge after the death of his son, told entirely outside the main narrative. It's a departure from the show's usual structure, and it works rather well. Lenny James and John Carroll Lynch, who plays his teacher Eastman, are both extraordinary in it. The Day Will Come When You Won't Be, the Season 7 premiere, is controversial and deliberately brutal. Whether you think it succeeded or failed probably depends on how you felt about the Season 6 cliffhanger it's resolving. What's indisputable is that it's committed to its choices in a way that demands a response from the viewer, which is more than you can say for a lot of television. Wrath, the Season 8 finale, divided opinion because of how it handled Negan's fate, and the division was not unreasonable. But it also set up something the show rarely committed to, the idea that breaking the cycle of violence might be worth trying, even when it's wrong in the moment. That idea carried through several seasons, slowly. What We Become from Season 10 is the Michonne episode, a Fever Vision alternative history sequence that imagines Michonne in a version of Rick's story that works far better than it has any right to. Guerrera carries it on pure performance. It ends with Michonne choosing to go looking for Rick, which is the last we see of her in the main series, and it's a good ending for the character in that specific context. These are not all of the good episodes. They're a selection. The show made something like 170 episodes across its run, and the best of them compare favourably with the best episodic television of their era. The worst of them are considerably less good. That range is wide, and the fact that the best exist is worth remembering when the worst get the most attention. So that's 150 facts, or thereabouts, counting the times I went slightly sideways into something adjacent, and we certainly did that once or twice, which is very much in the spirit of these things, I think. You start with the trivia, and you end up with something that feels a bit more like a portrait of a whole creative enterprise, with all its moving parts and human decisions and happy accidents and things that almost were. What I keep coming back to with The Walking Dead is how many of its best things were accidental or improvised or arrived at through the productive friction between what was planned and what turned out to be possible. Daryl Dixon wasn't planned. Carol's arc wasn't planned. The crossbow was Reedus's idea. The angel wings were the costume department. Glenn's first line was written to provide levity in the moment and became the most quoted line in fan memory. The show is full of these moments where someone made a choice because the circumstances demanded it, and the choice turned out to be the right one. There's something comforting in that, I think. A reminder that good things don't always come from good plans. Sometimes they come from paying attention to what's happening and responding to it honestly. It's also worth remembering, and I say this genuinely, not as a consolation, that for all the discussion of the show's decline and its missteps, it gave a lot of people something they genuinely valued. Not just entertainment, though there's nothing wrong with entertainment, but a story about what it means to stay human when the world stops rewarding humanity. About whether the people you choose to protect are worth the cost of protecting them. About whether you can do terrible things and remain, in some essential sense, yourself. Those are not small questions. The show asked them with varying degrees of success across its run, but it kept asking them, and the audience that stayed, and significant numbers did stay right through to the end, did so because those questions mattered to them. Morgan goes back to his son's walker and can't kill her. Rick apologizes to the legless woman in the park before he shoots her. Herschel quotes scripture in a prison yard while the world falls apart. Carol sits at a table in a cottage in the woods and tries to figure out if she can still be a person. These images accumulate across the franchise, and they add up to something that I think is worth the time it takes to receive them, even if the path between them is sometimes longer and rougher than it needed to be. One thing that doesn't come up much in discussions of the franchise's legacy is how consistently it treated its older characters with dignity. Herschel, Dale, Carol, who was middle-aged when the show began and aged through it. The older survivors in the Commonwealth. Television, particularly American genre television, doesn't always know what to do with characters past a certain age. And The Walking Dead, at its best, used them as its moral anchors. The people who remembered how things used to work, who carried the weight of what was lost, who were most aware of the gap between who they'd been and who they'd had to become. That's a specific kind of storytelling generosity that I think is worth naming. There are more videos coming, more corners of the Walking Dead world to go through. I've got thoughts about the Telltale games and about the specific texture of each showrunner's seasons, and about the comics' later arcs, and about all sorts of things we didn't have room for tonight. So if this was the kind of thing you wanted to hear, there'll be more of it. Right, that's 150, plus a few. I hope at least some of this kept you company tonight. If you're still awake somewhere in section 12, that's also fine. Not everything needs to end in sleep. Sometimes it's just nice to spend a quiet hour with something you like, going through it slowly, paying attention to the parts you normally move past too quickly. That's what this is, really. Good night, or good morning, or good whatever it is.